I am Professor Eduardo Navarro. I work at São Paulo University in Brazil, and my presentation is about the artificial indigenous toponyms in Brazil, created in 19th and 20th centuries. The languages of Aboriginal peoples have played an important role in the Brazilian toponymic system. Among the indigenous languages, one of them was fundamental for the naming of places in Brazil. Ancient Tupi of the coast, which gave birth to three other supraethnical general languages that developed historically from it starting in 17th century, when the colonization of Brazil interior began in Amazonia and in central parts of this country. Such a toponymy is one of the most visible documentations of the indigenous ancestry of Brazilian society. Concerning the other hundreds of indigenous languages spoken in the colonial period and in the 2 centuries after Brazil's independence, their individual participation in the naming of a Brazilian space was minor. Collectively, however, they played a considerable role in the toponymic system. Place names of these origins, however, are territorially circumscribed. Moreover, many of these names are untranslatable because they originate from languages that have disappeared and that had no written grammars. Ancient Tupi was spoken until the end of the 17th century. By contrast, the loss of Amazonian general language primacy to Portuguese in most of Amazonia occurred by the end of the 19th century, and it is spoken currently only on the upper Negro River. The general language of central Brazil disappeared together with the great European migratory flow to southern and southeastern Brazil from 1850 onwards. Thus, the hundreds of toponyms of indigenous origin appearing by the end of the 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century throughout Brazil are the results of artificial nomination. The creation of artificial toponyms can have several causes and motivations, among which we can mention the project of valuing national roots and cultural identities as a consequence of strengthening political nationalism. This was what happened in Brazil in the first half of the 20th century, when there was intense nomination in Amerindian languages spoken in the past. In the specific case of Brazil, the artificial nomination in indigenous languages is explained by certain cultural and sociological phenomena observed in the Western world since the 19th century. One of them was Romanticism, which valued the historical and national tradition over the aesthetic models of antiquity. One turns to the past in search of models and representations of the new nations emerging since then. In the case of Brazil, such models were the Indians of other centuries and the indigenous language spoken in the early days of conquest. The Tupi Indian who inhabited the coast was mythologized. Meanwhile, the many Indians still living in the 19th century in Brazil were socially undervalued and discriminated against, and their languages were ignored. With the advent of modernism in Brazil, the Indians of the past once again became a basic cultural reference for the aesthetic and cultural renewal that was intended. An environment was formed that was propitious to the studies of the Brazilian indigenous languages of historical importance, mainly ancient Tupi and Amazonian general language. This was also explained by the emergence of nationalist ideologies in the West. In Brazil, Getúlio Vargas' rise to power in 1930 was the beginning of a historical phase marked by great political and economic nationalism. The Vargas era was, in fact, a time when toponyms of indigenous origin were abundantly created in the country. In fact, a law of 1943 established norms for the elimination in the country of the repetition of toponyms of cities and towns, stating that it was recommended the adoption of indigenous names. Thus, in compliance with such a decree, many municipalities had their names replaced in the following year, many of them with Tupi names. Such a law had an evident nationalist meaning. It was the consequence of a strong statist tendency that the second Vargas government represented, one of the last echoes of the populist pacts that international capitalism would cause to collapse throughout the Third World in the 50s and 60s. This phenomenon was exemplified by the military coup of 1964 in Brazil, the fall of Perón in Argentina, and the deposition of Ahmed Sukarno in Indonesia. The names on which this study was focused were only those having Tupi origins, which are the most numerous and are fundamentally those of human settlements that became municipalities as their basic administrative units. Therein, one can find great onomastic variability, which does not occur with the names of physical and natural aspects of space. In fact, as Dosa reminds us, such names tend to be maintained throughout the centuries. Well, we can classify artificial place names of Tupi origin in Brazil in two main categories. The first one, appropriate place names. These are correctly formed toponyms assigned to places where the languages from which they originated were effectively spoken in the past. Or they are names of Tupi origin already incorporated in the Portuguese lexicon. If composed, they obey the composition rules of the Tupi origin languages in which they were created. The second category is that of the inappropriate place names. These place names can be classified into two other classes, two other categories. First one, geographically inadequate. These geographically inadequate place names are formed correctly from a grammatical point of view, but they are unduly attributed to places where the languages from which they originated were never spoken. The second category of inappropriate place names is that of the linguistically inadequate ones. They are formed incorrectly without respect to the rules of composition of the languages in which they were created, or with strong spelling, semantics, etc. They can also be hybrid names, formed by words from more than one indigenous language, effect caused by the ignorance on the part of their creator of the difference between them. Nevertheless, such toponyms name places where the languages used in their creation were spoken in the past. We have also geographically and linguistically inadequate place names. These are names unduly attributed to places where the languages from which they originated were never spoken and which were poorly formed linguistically, without respect for the rules of composition of the languages in which they were created, or with incorrect spelling, semantics, etc. They can also be hybrid names formed with words from more than one indigenous language of a Tupi origin. As an example, we have the name of the municipality of Unai. This is a compound name intended to mean Black River. Una in Tupi, in Old Tupi, means black. U means river. This was a compound noun intended to mean Black River by its creators. However, it violates the rules of composition of ancient Tupi and general languages. Unai was a district created with denomination of Rio Preto. Rio Preto in Portuguese means Black River. By state law of 1923, the district of Rio Preto, Black River, took its current name. However, in those above-mentioned indigenous languages, attributive adjectives never precede a noun. It's not like in English. In English, the attributive adjective precedes the noun, Black River. But in Old Tupi, that's not the case. Rio Preto should thus be translated as Una, not as Unai. Can you understand? Una is the correct form, but the form created was Unai. That is incorrect. Very well. Another example of municipality name in Brazil is Jaguariúna. The same thing occurred with this name. In 1896, the district of Jaguari was created by state law and was subordinated to the municipality of Mogi Mirim. By state law of 1944, the district of Jaguari took the name Jaguariúna, which it retained when it became a municipality in 1953. We see in Jaguariúna's coat of arms the motivation of the creator of this name, a black jaguar on the edge of a blue river, notwithstanding the fact that Black Jaguar River in ancient Tupi should be translated as Jaguaruni, resulting in the name Jaguaruni. The form Jaguariúna violates the rules of composition of ancient Tupi, from which the roots of such a word were taken. So you can see in this coat of arms this error, how this error is represented. A black jaguar that is near a river. It is an incorrect illustration. As a geographically and linguistically inadequate toponyms, we can mention the place name Umuarama. For the formation of the place name Umuarama, its creator took the Amazonian general language term Sumuara, that is, friend, unduly removed its prefix S and added the form Rama, a variant of Retama, that is, land. A land of friends. Sumuararama, in fact, would be a correct name. Removing the prefix s, however, the composition becomes meaningless. Moreover, the fact of assigning a name in Amazonian general language to a locality of southern Brazil is geographical nonsense. Another example is Mairiporã. Mairiporã is the name of a municipality in São Paulo state that is a hybridism formed by the composition of a word taken from general Amazonian language. Mairi means city in this language, and from a Guarani word, porã, that means beautiful. It was artificially created by state law in 1948 and replaced the old and spontaneous name Juqueri. The substitution of such a Tupi-origin name was due to the depreciative sense that this toponym assumed with the installation of a great psychiatric colony in that locality. Thus, a toponym emerged from languages that were never spoken in that region of Brazil. As we have asserted, the artificial place naming in ancient Tupi and in general languages coexists in Brazil with spontaneous toponym. And this fact goes unnoticed by many. This phenomenon hypertrophied the Tupi cultural influence, which indeed was considerable in formation of Brazilian civilization. It did not affect, as seen before, the nomination of physical and natural elements, such as rivers, streams, hills, mountains, etc., that are impervious to easy changes. Such toponyms have great importance as chronicles of the geographic space, revealing their past features. Although adequate and compatible names were created, meaningless and erroneously formed names also appeared, revealing nothing but the ignorance on the part of their creators and historical indigenous languages of Brazil. There is, however, a positive aspect to this artificial naming. It ennobled indigenous languages in a century characterized by great technological modernization, as was the case during the 20th century, when Indians often represented the past as well social and economic backwardness. It was a way for Brazil to honor the losers of its history. Such a phenomenon also meant a nostalgic tribute to a traditional Brazil that was beginning to be transformed, modernizing itself. It represented the voices of a past that did not want to die. Thank you very much.
That was a great presentation, super interesting. Always great to look at indigenous languages, which are such a crucial part of onomastics, right? Like there's so many layers of naming.
Oh, it looks like there's a question in the comments.
It's a comment. Fascinating presentation. I was born in Washington State in the United States, where indigenous place names like oh, I'm probably going to mispronounce these, Suquamish, Samamish, Topenish, Snohomish, and Snoqualmie confound newcomers but roll off our tongues as if it were nothing. I wonder how badly I mangled those. Yeah, I am from New Jersey originally, and there are lots of indigenous place names there that people, and some of them are closer to the original Native American languages, and some have sort of been anglicized over times, but there are loads of them, and people are often surprised on the East Coast that there are still so many indigenous place names that continue to exist. You know, you tend to think especially of the East Coast as being, you know, the first colonized and the first where English names were laid over everything.